All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Aaron. I'm a staff engineer with a company called Rival, who you haven't heard of because we're in stealth mode. So don't ask me what we do because I'm not allowed to tell you. It's all very, very exciting stuff, though. Let me assure you. I head up the front-end development team, which is growing. I started out, we were 8 people in the office, and now we're 23 in just 8 months, so growing very rapidly. We're also hiring. I don't want to steal anybody's thunder here, but actually the reason I wanted to give this talk is because we're hiring, and I've spent the last, I don't know, 8 months or so on the phone with probably like 600 different developers or something like that, going through our pipeline of trying to find good people. And so I talked to a lot of front-end people, talked to a lot of React people, and one of the first things that we get into once we discover that we both on the phone share an interest in React is we start talking about software architecture and how do you build a cool, performant React app. And certain patterns started emerging from this conversation around how do you use, when do you use stateful and when do you use stateless components. And it felt a little weird to me, the architecture that seemed, at least from these conversations, to be very popular. And I went online and there's quite a lot of stuff written about this stuff in the blogosphere and on Medium and stuff about this. A lot of it is wrong. So I thought, why not talk about it tonight? So this is either going to be an extremely boring talk to you because you agree with me and you're like, yeah, whatever. Or hope maybe some people will learn something. Maybe some people will think I'm completely nuts. But anyway, and if you're interested in talking to a guy who might be completely nuts about a job, hit me up afterwards. I'll hang out, and I'm happy to talk to smart people. So at Rival, one of the things that that I put in place, or that we put in place from the very beginning, was we like to work with metrics. So we like to deal with when we're coding. Obviously there's user-side metrics, there's how fast is the thing, what's the perception of how fast the thing is, are we offering a consistent experience to users so that buttons always look the same and menus always behave the same and page things always look the same, so that when people are in our app they know they're in our app and they aren't confused by different experiences from page to page or from app to app. And then is it reliable and et cetera and blah blah blah, all of the different kinds of things that you're used to talking about the user side. But I think a lot of times people leave out another very important aspect of how you drive your code patterns and your architectural decisions and all that, and that is, what's the developer experience like, right? So how easy is it to maintain the code? How easy is it to test? How easy is it to add new features or remove features? How easy is it to compose things in useful ways so that you're not rewriting the same thing over and over or copying and pasting and changing the variable names, right? So how easy is it, how fun is it for the developer, right? That's a really important thing too. And so we're going to talk about all of that stuff as it applies to React, and especially this particular pattern that I came up with. So the question that I have is this: are stateless or function components an anti-pattern? It seems to me that all the stuff I've read about it seems to think that no, it's a great pattern. You should, in fact, I've seen a lot of people that are like, no, you should use stateless components if you can, like as the default thing, right? And so for those of you that aren't really deep into React or whatever, a stateless component or a function component is basically, it's a function that returns some JSX or some HTML, basically some HTML or whatever it is, some rendering. As opposed to a class instance that you create that has lifecycle methods and all the rest of it. So I started researching this. A lot of the confusion seems to be around whether or not this is a more performant pattern than loading up a component, a full component, right? That somehow this is going to render faster, or somehow makes your life easier, or somehow better than a stateful component, let's call it. So I thought about it, and I wanted to find out what Facebook itself had to say about it. And Oh, well, let's talk, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's look at a typical React and Redux flow. You can use Redux, everybody, that's a common library for handling your application state, so that's what I'm using in the example here, but you can substitute that for any one of your MobX or whatever you want to use. But this is the pattern that in a lot of these interviews and a lot of these things that I see, right? I have some parent, this may not be the parent of the whole entire app. We may be talking about a subtree of componentry, right? But at some point I have some high-level component that understands how to talk to state, and then below that I've got all of these stateless children that receive these props and that display information and maybe respond to user interactions and pass events up to the thing. And so you've got this world of where data goes downstream, right? And events flow upstream, which is kind of a common pattern that people talk about. Okay, so that is the thing that I'm talking about. And I've got some issues with stateless. It's still a component, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. But it causes useless re-renders of my tree, right? So, and we'll talk about that as well. It's very brittle. It violates separations of concerns, and it can make it very hard or harder to debug than other patterns that are out there. So those are the problems that I have with stateless components, and now we're going to dive into what that's all about. And here's the bit that I was getting to before. So I did some research, and I'm like, well, what does Facebook have to say about stateful versus stateless? Because if you do a search on Google, a lot of developers have a lot of things to say about it. But I wanted to know, like, what does Facebook say? So I go into the documentation and specifically into their talk about, components where they introduce stateless. Can't remember exactly. Oh, you'll see where it is because I have the URL. But this is what they have to say. That in their documentation around components and props, that the above two components, which is stateless or stateful, are equivalent from React's point of view. They're equivalent. It's the same exact thing, which might be surprising to some people, and we're going to dig into that. So, but what that means is that the two things that you see here, right? A stateless just function component and class my component extends component, it's the same thing. Exactly the same thing. So you're not gaining anything by going with the thing. So here's my aside. Let's just talk through that. So I went ahead and I did an excerpt of the React source code. I always think it's a great idea to dive into the source code of the framework you're using so you understand how it really actually works, right? So let's do that. We're going to do this very, very quickly. This page, by the way, is, these snippets are available. I have on my GitHub, I have a little demo project, which is a to-do list, because that's what everybody does in React for some reason. They all do to-do lists to make examples. So I have one branch which is stateless and one branch which is stateful, which you can download at your pleasure and have a look at. And in there, you'll see this React walkthrough. We're not going to go through all of the things, but what I want to show you is this. So when you call React dom.render, and you're going to render your hello world, and in, let's say instead of passing, h1 or whatever, I'm passing my stateless function, right? It goes through a bunch of stuff, but the important thing is to understand that at some point, because of redirection with Babel or whatever, that's actually calling this React mount.render function. And so this React.render function gets our stateless component in this thing called render subtree into container, blah, 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 goes through a bunch of stuff. And then you get to this interesting thing, you end up calling render new component with this next element variable, which still happens to be our functional component. It's been wrapped in another thing, but that's not important for what we're talking about. But what you do is you get to a bit in the code where they say component instant equals instantiate React component. What? I thought that functional components were super performant because they didn't plug into the life cycle tree of React components. I thought that they were they were special in some way and different. Well, as it turns out, if you go down and you look into instantiate React component all the way down here, you find out that at some point it's actually instantiating a new React composite component wrapper. And if you look at what that is, this is a fancy way of inheritance when you're not using ES6. This is basically saying that the React composite component wrapper is just a subclass of React composite component, which happens to be a React component, which means if I pass my functional component into render, React, under the hood, turns that into an actual real component. The only difference being, now I don't have access to any of the lifecycle events, because I just have a function instead of a class instance. But I actually don't have a class instance. I have a wrapped class instance, which is abstracted and hidden away from me all of the good parts of having that class instance. So it's not more performant because it's going through the same exact render as an actual React component. But it's a second class React component because I don't have access to any of the good parts that allow me to get into the stuff that we're going to get into. So again, this page is available. You can walk through that yourself, or just get onto the GitHub, React GitHub, and go through it yourself. It's very interesting and fun stuff. So let's look at the render tree of a stateless component, right? If I'm at the parent level, every time a prop changes in the parent, I necessarily have to re-render that whole entire tree every single time, right? So if that parent's plugged into Redux, every single time map state to props gets called, that whole entire tree is going to get re-rendered. And yes, Facebook or React eventually will do a diff of the output of all the render functions and will not replace the DOM if it doesn't need to. That's great, and that's wonderful. But the fact of the matter is all of those render functions got called, and all of the overhead of creating the same HTML or whatever it is, again, you have to pay that, right? And that's true even if I want to change a prop way down here, because if this child is getting its prop from here, from here, from here, in order for this one child to change the name, let's say this is a user profile, right? And this guy's displaying just the user email. We have some user email display component, which is very, very low level. All it does is display a user email. Well, in order for that thing to change the email when it gets updated, I've got to re-render this whole entire tree. And the deeper that goes, the more stuff I have to re-render, right? So that's kind of scary. And yes, you could say, well, you got to see if, doing my should component update match, if that actually is less performant than just chucking the whole thing away and re-rendering it. And if you're doing that, then you're passing the wrong props as well, because should component update should be super, super, super fast. We'll get into that in a second too. All right, other problem that I have with this, if I want to remove this child, then I need to understand how that affects this child and this child, right? So my separation of concerns is completely violated in the sense that this child must necessarily have knowledge of what's going on in this child. What events does it know about? What data does it need in order for this whole thing to function? So it's very brittle. I can't change any of the things in the tree, because if I change any things in the tree, then I risk breaking stuff that's downstream. And if you're doing the kind of prop passing, which is, open curly braces, my props, ... the rest of the stuff that I'm not interested in, and that's what I pass down to the child, then good luck debugging that when something goes wrong, right? Because I have no idea. It's a black box. I'm just passing stuff through. Who knows what that is? So the separation of concerns is violated, right? Every single child must know about its upstream and downstream children and parents what everybody needs. And that's horribly difficult to maintain. So the question that I have is, what if we flip this around and we make every single component stateful, right? What does that look like? My cool animation for tonight. Okay, so now, and again, we're just using Redux as an example. You can use whatever library you want, but the point is that whatever library you're using to manage your application state, what if every single child or every single component at this point is plugged into that and is able to manage its own state? Read state from the state tree, change it, dispatch things, all of that stuff. That means that when I want to change a prop here, only this child re-renders. That's the only thing, right? And when I need to remove this child for whatever reason, we don't want it anymore, I don't have to worry about this, because these guys are all autonomous. I can pull this child out and I can throw it into some other component tree and it still works. It's true, there may be some sort of very small amount of properties like an ID. Maybe I'm passing a user ID, or maybe I'm getting a user ID from state, or maybe I'm getting a user ID from the URL, who knows? It's possible and it's totally legitimate that I might be passing one single small identifier down through the thing, but the difference between that and passing a whole entire user profile with all of its data is pretty significant. So each component owns its own data, it can dispatch its changes on its own, it's autonomous, it's flexible, the concerns are not, separation of concerns are not violated. So what are the benefits? It's a component, which means I have access to all of the lifecycle stuff, so that's a good thing, right? I haven't cut myself off from that. I have access, importantly, to should component update. We'll talk about that next slide, I think. It's flexible, separation concerns, easier to debug because when something goes wrong in my one little thing, I know exactly where to look for the problem. The email's not displaying correctly, well, let's just go to the email display component and see what's going wrong, right? So it's easier to debug and it's easier to test. Because all of these things are separated, it's really easy for me now to stub out everything around that component and just test that component completely in isolation. You're all doing unit testing and functional testing with your front-end apps, right? Yes, we hope so. If you're not, try this, it makes it easier. Okay, so I'm not saying you don't ever use stateless. That's why the talk is you almost always should use stateful. Because you can't, stateless is absolutely useful when it's at the very end of a branch, and it's a super usable thing that does not necessarily need to know anything about state. Things like buttons, form elements, input things, and you know, I want to have a cool little email input thing that validates that it's an email address, that kind of stuff. Styled containers, and also as the representational layer of a higher order component, right? Where all my logic and stuff is wrapped up in some higher order component, and all I need is something that displays whatever the result of that is, right? So we have a rule at Rival where we're allowed to use stateless components at most one level deep from the parent, right? So I can have a parent which is plugged into state, one stateless component, but I can't go beyond that with a second level of stateless component because then we get into that whole weird tree, right? And speaking of which, in my should component update, right, if I've got one child that's a stateless component, I don't have to worry about useless re-renders because the smart parent can block those and just say, no, I don't need to re-render because I'm done, and then your stateless component is not going to have to render uselessly. Okay, so to wrap it all up, some final best practices. Which come from this, because there's some side effects to plugging all of my components into state, right? It means that every time, if I'm using Redux, every time state changes, all of my components have their map state to props called, every single one. If I have 1,000 components, that's 1,000 map state to props functions that are called. Now, there's a couple of ways around that. Maybe don't use Redux. We're looking at RxJS or an observable pattern, which is a lot better at only updating those things that know that they need to be updated. So that's one way around that. But even so, whatever you're doing in your version of map state to props and reacting to changes, you need to make sure that you're kicking out very, very early when you discover that you're not interested in those changes. And you need to make sure you don't do any heavy lifting, no calculations, no management of data, anything like that. All of your calculations of things, if I have a report and I want to generate a total, that total gets generated in my reducer somewhere, or maybe I spin up a worker if I need a worker to do like heavy lifting, and then that goes back into state, so that by the time I get to map state to props, all my data is prepped, ready, I don't have to do anything with it, I just pluck it out and display it to the user, right? Really important, only pass primitives in props. And this is another thing that you're allowed to do now when everything's plugged into state. If you're not plugged into state, you're forced to pass these huge objects down through the tree, and everybody takes their bit of information off of it, right? But then when you get to should component update, it's very expensive to check and make sure that this user object is not the same as the other user object that you already had in order to kick out and decide that you don't need to render. But if all I'm passing is a user ID, that's super fast and super performant. So I don't need to worry about slow should component updates, which is another thing you want to do. Okay, and then always use your should component update or pure component. We actually created a subclass of component which we can pass through the props that we're interested, the names of the props we're interested in checking, and then this thing automatically just wraps all that logic up and implements should component update for us. So it's dead simple to implement that. What else do I have here? Oh, that's it. There's my GitHub with this talk, and that's me. If you're interested in talking about work, hit me up later or ask me questions.
With like having stateful components sometimes, it's nice to have. I think you're talking about kind of like the container architecture or whatever, where you have containers that hold everything. So do you have some time for some?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So we do have this little box Sean has here. We'll throw it at you if you have a question. So go ahead and raise your hand.
I got a question.
You throw it, Sean. It's off.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So do you use any sort of selector engine, reselect or something with your map state prop?
We don't yet, but that's the next thing to add. Yeah, absolutely.
You had some suggestions there. I think reselect is another way to optimize your map.
I agree 100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Who's next? Right behind your end.
So in the last slide, you mentioned about pure component, but if you dive deep into the difference of pure component versus a stateless component. I was just curious. I only read the documentation and I started using it, but based on the documentation just because that's more performance. I was wondering if you had a little bit more.
Yeah, so the difference between, so you've got component, you've got pure component, and you've got your function, right? So the difference is that pure component is only implements should component update of all the lifecycle events. So you don't get component did mount, you don't get any of that stuff. You get should component update, and they implement it for you, and they do a shallow comparison between the props. Which means if you're managing your props correctly and you're only passing primitive values, so I'm only passing booleans or strings or numbers, I'm not passing any arrays, I'm not passing any objects, I'm not passing anything that's not a primitive value, then pure component will be fine because when it does that shallow comparison, it'll give you the right response. But the minute that you put into your props an array, then should component update will always return true from pure component, and you won't get any performance benefit. So if you end up passing arrays or anything like that, then yes, you're going to end up needing to use the full component, should component update, so you can do a deep comparison. And one thing I want to say about that, with the pattern of using like redux and map state to props, you're often going to find that even though I'm only passing in like a user ID as a string, by the time I get through map state to props, props is populated with all sorts of objects like user data and things like that that is pulled out of state, which is fine because that's how it's supposed to work, and I'm not passing those props around anywhere, but now my should component update needs to be smarter than pure component can offer me because of all those props that I've injected into it through map state to props. Does that make sense? So in that sense, your kind of pure component is sort of, once you get into like anything beyond like a simple to-do app, pure component's probably not going to do that much for you for your day-to-day kind of like heavy-duty components, but it's probably useful for smaller ones down the line.
All right, any more questions? We have one over here.
I've heard that they have plans, the Basic team has plans to make stateless functional components optimized in the future. Have you heard about that? Or heard
yeah, they've been saying that since like React 0.14. So I'm not holding my breath. My feeling as a software engineer is don't architect for something that a third party may or may not do in the future, no matter how loudly they claim they'll do it. Now, you can future-proof yourself by maybe leaving yourself a comment, a tag or something in those places where you go, when that happens, this would be probably a candidate. But and the fact of the matter is that the best that they're going to be able to do is going to be to make some sort of a pure component version of that, right? Because how deeply could they actually check? They can't do a deep equal because it would just be too dangerous, I think. So at the end of the day, you're still probably going to want to do your own should component update. And again, if you're plugged into state to props, it's not really about rendering speed at that point. It's more about how easy is it for me as a developer to debug this thing and test it and all of that other stuff.
Cool. One last question. Do we have anybody else? Right there in the back.
Okay, wait question. What issues do you have with debugging?
Sorry?
What issues do you have with platform?
No, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, you can set them up and mock them out. I'm more talking about finding the bug. Well, for example, so if my function component is at the very end of the tree, and it's only plugged into one component, which is its parent component above it, then I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem when it's this tree of components that are going, there's this hierarchy of components and they're all stateless, and I'm passing props through this chain of things. It's more complicated to figure out where something went wrong because as I'm passing these props down through, who knows at what point the prop got altered or removed or added or whatever. When everybody's plugged directly into state, then if I have an issue with the data that I'm seeing, or there's some behavior that's going wrong, I check that component, I check the reducer, I check the action, I check my saga or whatever it is that I'm using, and those are kind of the places that I'm going to check. I don't have to check this hierarchy of components. That's basically what I mean.
It sounds like you changed one kind of complexity with another kind of complexity.
How so?
Because you have like 1,000 of connected components instead of one like kind of giant object passed down.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I'm saying. So I've already got a giant object, which is state.
Well, yeah.
Right? So that's one giant object. I don't see how adding a second giant object to the thing helps simplify my problem. Instead, I want to look at like, where's my connection to that giant object, and how is each individual behaving in that? So again, if I'm looking at the email component and that email is not coming out correctly, then if that's a stateful component, I just look there. If instead there's some parent that's loading up user profile and passing everything down through, then I'm forced to look there, and then here, and then here, and then here, and then here, until I find out where the problem is. And I still have to look at all of that other stuff.
Yeah, I understand. There's people with another kind of problem. Okay, but it's a side call. Regarding your component, the problem with it, yeah, that, all right, it checks everything. I have a very quick comment. It checks all the properties.
Yes, it does.
That's a problem.
Which is also a problem, yeah.
Yeah, and another comment is, regarding performance and how they can solve this problem of functional. So they probably they will not create instance. And if you remember, create component or create class, I don't know right now, function, which they had like in the second version of React, probably. So it was like a 40% slower than ES6 classes.
Yeah.
So there is a way, right, for improvement. So they already made it, faster. So maybe there's also a way for them to make it faster.
When they do, we'll talk.
Yeah. As I said,
It sounds like a good conversation.
Yeah, let's have a beer after and we'll talk about it.
Let's give another round of applause.
Thanks, everybody.